There is a way that seems right to a man, but it only brings him death. We are so self-deceived. Our capacity for self-deception is so great that we can convince ourselves that something is moral and right when it isn't. Now, how do we avoid that? Today, I'm going to explain to you how the Western world arrived at the place where it is, where up is down and down is up. You might say that today we're really answering the question, not only how we got there, but how we can get out of it. Well, I'm going to answer that question today. I'm going to do it by explaining to you three views of history, three ideologies and the way that they view history and its flow. And in understanding that, you'll understand a little bit what is driving the Western world, what the real ideological, competition actually is, what it looks like. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton, and today I'm going to explain to you how we got in this mess. That is, how the Western world arrived at the place where it is, where up is down and down is up. So you might say that today we're really answering the question, not only how we got there, but how we can get out of it. People ask me all the time, what can I do? Well, I'm going to answer that question today. I'm going to do it by explaining to you three views of history, three views of history, three ideologies and the way that they view history and its flow. And in understanding that, you'll understand a little bit what is driving the Western world, what the real ideological, competition actually is, what it looks like. And then we'll discuss the way we get out of it. Now, I do want to say this at the front end. I feel pretty upbeat and optimistic these days. This is a conversation I've been having with Lawrence Fox on the other show that I do, which is WTF, World of Taunton and Fox. And that's because he's been feeling a little bit down. And me, post-November presidential elections, I feel much more hopeful that we can stem the tide, particularly the moral tide of the direction that we've been going and head in a completely different one. But we can't sit on our hands. And it's important that we understand how we got here in the first place. So I'm going to explain that to you today in terms that I think you're going to find pretty simple, pretty easy to follow. Now, do understand a couple of things. First of all, that out of necessity, I'm moving at 50,000 feet above. We're not getting down into the weeds, so there is some need to simplify. The second thing that is important for you to understand is that there are no absolute beginnings when we're talking about the flow of history. Let's take, for example, the origins of World War I. How did it start? Well, most of the time we point to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. But the fact of the matter is it's more complicated than that. Now, we do point to that. We point to it rightly just by way of sort of simplifying that was, you might say that was the last straw that broke the camel's back. But Europe had been moving in this direction for quite some time. And we can go back to the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. We could go back even further to the Napoleonic Wars. And then before that, the wars of Louis XIV. So the point is, in trying to find an absolute beginning, we'd have to go back to the Garden of Eden, okay? And it's the same with the flow of ideas. But when it comes to the Western world, and we can point to watershed moments in history, things that we can say something definitely changed in the world as a result of this or that event. And in the Western world, we can say, I think, that really the beginning of major trouble began in the year 1859. Now, this is looking at, modern history. And in America, American history, we define modern as post-1877. That's post-Reconstruction. In Europe, modern history is typically defined as post-1815. That is after the Napoleonic War. So don't understand modern in the sense that we use it in daily vernacular, which means, maybe, the last 20 or 30 years. And historians are speaking in much longer periods of time. So modern history, modern European history, we look to 1859. Now, why do I think that that date is so key towards our understanding of how we got into such a big mess? Well, it's because it was in that year that Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, also known as The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, you need to understand that Charles Darwin, who was fairly typical of his own generation, of his own time, he was an unabashed racist. We know this from his more careful in some of his published works, but in his own letters, he talks about the supremacy. He was this white supremacist. He believed that the African people, the Aborigines of Australia, that these were subspecies, that they were somehow kind of a link, in the chain of from ape to human beings. Another man, a Frenchman who dabbled with the idea of evolution, macroevolution, as we might call it, the Marquis de Gobineau. He said that man is not descended from apes, but he is rapidly becoming one. Now, on the surface of that looks kind of funny. Like you might agree with it and go, gosh, we are rapidly becoming that. But he meant it quite literally. And what he meant by that, which Darwin, I think, would agree with this, was that if the white races are intermarrying, with other races, they quickly become more and more like them and thus more ape-like. So you begin to see just how utterly racist they were in their own thinking. And the left wants to deny this, the same way they want to do with, say, Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was, she was a racist, and Margaret Sanger was very much a believer in eugenics, but they don't want to discuss that. They're just thrilled with the fact that she wanted to kill human beings. So anyway, Darwin, with the publication of The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, he laid out his full theory, and his full theory, of course, was this idea that history, now here's a view of history, that history was moving irresistibly in a particular direction. Now, philosopher Karl Popper would call this historicism. Historicism is this idea that history is moving in a particular direction, that is to say, irresistibly in a particular direction. So Darwin believed that it was, but he believed that it was biologically driven, that biological factors were determining the flow of history. He wasn't so much thinking in terms of, of things like, the 30 Years' War or the Enlightenment or the Reformation or any of those kinds of things. He was just thinking in biological terms, that we are moving from simple organisms to more and more complex ones. And so in that sense, history has a flow. Now, it's fascinating to note that in this period of time, we'll say the mid to late 19th century, that what is set loose on the world, I think largely in part due to, to Darwin's ideas here, we have some of the most murderous, genocidal ideas that were set loose upon the entire world and upon the Western world in particular. And those are fascism and Marxism. But Marxism is the earliest version of this. Now, when we think of Karl Marx wanted to dedicate Das Kapital, his enormous, it's really just kind of, it's virtually unreadable. You should try reading it. It's sort of full of factory reports and data and all this kind of stuff, but Das Kapital, or Capital, he wanted to dedicate it to Charles Darwin. Now that does seem a little odd. He'd never met Darwin, but he was absolutely captivated by The Origin of Species. Now, we have to go back to when Marx and Engels published, let's see, what was it? The Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1844. So he's already publishing in the 1840s. In 1848 is when the Communist Manifesto was published. But for him, reading The Origin of Species, it was a game changer for him. And he began to see it in his later writings, post-1859 writings. And that is because what he did was he took Darwin's paradigm, his evolutionary paradigm, and he applied it to history. How so? Well, he began to see history as being driven in a particular direction too. So history, in his case, it was less about biology. See, this was the idea that he took from Darwin. History wasn't being driven so much by biology, according to Marx. It was being driven by what? Class warfare. Class warfare. So that was the way he began to see it. Now you got to take just a second here because my chalk is getting very small. Hang on here while I get more chalk. This was always a joke with my students that Mr. Taunton is always running out of things to write with, but we'll just keep working on that. So here you have his idea that we are moving through history, and for him it was the dialectic. And the dialectic was this idea that you had synthesis, antithesis, and then thesis, antithesis, and then there was this clash, and then you produced synthesis. And then synthesis became thesis, antithesis, and then a clash again, and you produce synthesis, meaning that history was moving irresistibly in a particular direction. And for him, it was moving from, the snatch and grab phase to feudalism, up to, capitalism, and then eventually to socialism and the utopia of socialism, strictly speaking, communism. So when we refer to communism and socialism, the definitions have to be a little bit loose just because of the way we use them. So we refer to, say, communist China or communist North Korea, but Marx would say, no, they're not communist. He would say they're socialist. They're socialist because they haven't yet reached the utopian stage. The utopian stage where supposedly there's no one to rule over anybody and everybody shares and shares alike, and it's the socialist utopia is communism. And of course that has never been achieved. But again, the idea that drives a socialist understanding of history is that it is class warfare. It is a war of economics. That's what's driving history. That's the engine behind history. Now, then we have fascism. Now, fascism, like Marxism, it incorporates a Darwinian paradigm into history. And it is important that you understand that both fascism and Marxism are godless. They're both absolutely atheistic. Now, sometimes people argue with me on this. A woman said to me on Twitter, she referred to an Albanian socialist, a Marxist hero, and she said, hey, he was a Muslim. And no, he wasn't. And what I mean by that is this: you cannot faithfully be a Marxist, be a socialist, be a communist, and be a believer in any kind of God. And that is because they are, by definition, atheistic. They are, as Dostoevsky put it, it's not an effort to build the Tower of Babel to mount heaven, but to bring heaven down to earth. It's sort of the ideology, or ideology as we say on this show, because it's idiots, who buy into this, is driven by a godless worldview. It assumes that there is no God. It assumes there is no soul, that we as human beings are just like plants. You give us some water, you give us a little bit of sunlight, and poof, we grow. And it discounts utterly the soul. So a way of putting it might be something like this: in the socialist, or indeed even in the fascist worldview, man exists to serve the state. And that's because man is a temporal being and the state is an eternal institution. In a traditional Western, which is to say a Christian worldview, because Western governments, whether they know it or not, have been largely founded upon a Judeo-Christian ideal, not perfectly so, but largely it's what's given rise to the West as we know it, it reverses that idea. The state, a temporal institution, exists to serve man, an eternal being. You see the difference? You see the difference. And you see this in what's happening with Western governments. You know, when you look at the things that we've witnessed over the course, you know, not just the last 4 years, but particularly the last 4 years where it's all been sort of picking up speed. You're talking about governments that are completely dismissive of the electorate. They just don't care. And that's a fairly new development in the West. I mean, typically politicians, Western politicians, would at least pretend to be interested in what their constituents have to say. Not this lot. Not the kind of people that we see coming out of the World Economic Forum or who are members of it. I think they're all told to ignore what their constituents, the electorate, actually wants, and instead implement the ideas that are coming out of places like the West that are a combination of, on the one hand, a kind of Marxism, a socialism, and then fascism. So that brings us back to fascism. So both of them, again, are godless, okay? So when we talk about fascism, what do we really mean when we say fascism? Well, a more simple definition of fascism looks something like this. It is an ideology that, in contrast to socialism or Marxism, fascism is of the view that you can have private property, okay? So Marxism, socialism, communism, there's supposed to be no private property. In fascism, there is. It's just that it is controlled by the state. You own it, but the way that it is used is directed by the state, typically for warfare. So kind of an old definition would look, and I say an old definition because more modern definitions, I've noticed they keep changing. They keep changing, and it's because they want to give a definition that sounds more like MAGA. You know, where you read it, you immediately, picture people wearing red hats that say, "Make America Great Again," that kind of thing. And that's not what fascism is. Fascism is a strict regimentation of the economy for war. So that's what ESG is. That's what DEI is. It's not just simply about getting diverse, boards or employees. It is because they want to direct, they want to control the reins of corporate America and Europe and elsewhere. They want to control it and direct how that wealth is used. And in this case, it's for war on domestic populations. You may say, well, how is it war on domestic populations? If you look at the things that have been happening across the board in corporate America for the last several years, you see that, again, just as we've seen with politicians, they don't care. They don't care if they lose money. They generally don't care if they upset their constituents. That's what happened with, say, Bud Light and with Disney and Target and on and on and on we go. So, and that's because they become ideologically driven and they become fascist. Fascist. A lot of people are saying that what we're seeing is socialist, it's Marxist. We're seeing Marxist tactics, but when you're talking about the control of corporate America and using it against the American people itself, that's fascism. That is a classic definition of fascism. And like socialists, they believe that history is also moving irresistibly in a particular direction. But again, it's not being like Darwin's view. There's no God who is involved in this. Darwin would kind of, in conversation and such, maybe a presentation or even in some of his writing, kind of give a nod to the idea of God so as not to truly upset people. But Darwin was an atheist, and there was no room for God in his macroevolutionary view. Now, I do know that I'm not silly enough to think, naive enough to think that there aren't people who have taken his model and then tacked God onto it, and that's what we call theistic evolution. That's not a Darwinian notion. Darwin didn't really believe in that, and it's really kind of a silly idea when you really get down into the nuts and bolts of it. It's just a way to kind of make religious people feel pretty good about accepting this view. Anyway, so In Marx's view, it's class warfare. In the socialist view, it is class warfare, and that we're becoming, and again, like Darwin, we move from simple organisms to more complex ones. In Marx's view, we move from more simple economics to we're moving through stages of history to something much more complex and much more desirable. So again, stole the idea from Darwin. But when we're talking about fascists, what is it that they believe? What is their distinction with socialists? Well, in their view, it is a war of the blood. Or we could say it is a war of races. To use Darwin's expression in the name of his book, favored races, that there is this war. And so they believe, and you see this with Adolf Hitler, for example, the idea, he came to the conclusion that evolution had determined that the superior race, the most advanced race, was Aryans, and all the others need to be eliminated, that was kind of their moral responsibility to eliminate such people. But again, this is the distinction between the two. So from a socialist, a Marxist, a communist point of view, history is moving irresistibly from the simple to the more complex through economic stages. It's all about economic warfare. Again, thesis, antithesis, there's a conflict of some kind, and then what comes out of it as a new stage of history, synthesis. And eventually that develops an antithesis, an opposing view, and there's a conflict again, and then what comes out of it is yet another stage of history, synthesis. Well, in the fascist view, the fascists also borrowed from Darwin this idea, which wasn't really Darwin's idea, but it's not worth getting into it, this idea of moving from simple to complex, and that it was happening not through economics, not through class warfare, but it was happening through race wars. And that, here's Adolf Hitler who comes along, and they decide that, that they have to wipe out the other races, particularly Jews, because they were polluting the races. This was the way they understood history. I want to be 100% clear. That's not just anti-Semitic, it's evil. It's absolutely evil if you believe that. If you blame the sins of humanity on a particular, color group or a race, an ethnicity. It isn't that. I thought it was interesting a couple of days ago, I was looking at a list. I should have included it here today, but it was a list of the Bolsheviks, and it listed how many of them Russians, Lithuanians, Germans, Poles, Estonians, and then it said Jews. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because Judaism is a religion, and it is an identity. But all the others were not listed according to what their religious backgrounds might have been or might not have been. Did the Russians come from a Russian Orthodox background? Did the Germans come from a Lutheran or a Catholic background? How about the Poles? Were they mostly Catholic? What we do know is that they were all atheists, because as I pointed out, to believe in this, if you're to understand what you really believe, you must be an atheist. In the same way that a Yankees fan cannot simultaneously be a Red Sox fan. And some of you may say, well, sure you can. Well, not consistently. They play each other, and you have to take a side. So at some point, there's a clash. So you're either one or you're the other. You must decide. And so it is with this. You can't be consistently a Christian or a Muslim and also be, say, an evolutionist or a socialist or a fascist. You just simply can't be that. But in this case, Jews were not broken down according to the country they were from. They were just listed as a religious group. And all the others, that wasn't true of. And that's what anti-Semites do. But anyway, again, it's a war of the races. Now, one of the things that I really want you to understand here is that you hear this term alt-right. You've heard the expression alt-right. I hate the expression, and the left, via their media co-conspirators, has been very successful in labeling a fringe element alt-right. And what I want to tell you is they're not right. They're actually left. So when you see someone like, say, Candace Owens or Andrew Tate or the pseudo-historian Daryl Cooper spouting their anti-Semitic nonsense and talking about what starts moving in a direction of a kind of belief in a certain kind of totalitarianism, that is not alt-right. It is actually alt-left. So you cannot, for instance, go in two opposite directions and arrive at the same place. You can't say that I'm opposite from the left and then go this way, but arrive at the same place where they are. And the point that I'm trying to make is this. Okay, I've erased my board here so as not to confuse you among all the other things that I had on this board here. And it takes just a minute to do it because, JD, you did a great job. You built for us a blackboard, a chalkboard the size of a tractor trailer. But I want to show you the difference between leftist ideology and what we would call conservatism. So for your left and your right, we have over here, we have the right and we have the left. Now, just a minute ago, I was explaining to you that the so-called alt-right is not actually alt-right. They're alt-left. They are a product of the left. And that is because, historically speaking, when we're talking about conservatism, or rather when we're talking about, say, communism, Marxism, leftist academics, because they kind of like it, they're willing to acknowledge that it belongs over here. So we would say that Marxism, socialism, communism, they all belong over here. But they like to say that fascism belongs over here. And it doesn't. Now, I'm sorry to say that a long time ago, I taught it that way. And that's because I was taught it that way as an undergraduate. I was taught it that way in graduate school. And some point in my young academic career, it began to dawn on me, you know what? Fascism doesn't belong over here. It belongs over here. I don't care what the dictionary definition is. It belongs over here. Now, why is that? Well, that is because when we're talking about the right, when we're talking about what we would call conservatism, which is on the right, we're talking about over here, we're talking about freedom, okay? So anything that is opposed to freedom is moving in this direction. So the conservative notion of government is that government exists to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, to secure the blessings of liberty. That's a conservative view of government. It's a smaller view of government. It's a view of government that government gets out of the way of the people. It's a view of government that there are fewer controls of the economy, fewer controls of people, and the laws that exist to preserve those freedoms. That's what it's there for. So over here, this is all about big government. This is all about strict control of the economy, strict control of the people, and hence they're loving what's happening with technology because they see it as yet another way of controlling the people. So in a few weeks, I'll be at the World Economic Forum in Davos again, and let me tell you, those people are all over here. But I want you to understand that fascists belong over here. And that is because Marxism and fascism and socialism, communism, they're twin bastard children of the same leftist ideologies. It's just that one's just slightly different than the other. One of them sees history as a war of races. The other one sees it as a war of economic classes, but they all kind of arrive at the same place insofar as there's some minor differences between them, but they arrive at the same place and they're both totalitarian. So how academics have forever maintained that fascism is somehow an extreme expression of the right, and that Marxism and its extreme expression of the left, it isn't true. And that is because you cannot go in opposite directions and arrive at the same place. Totalitarianism. You can't. So I hope that's particularly clear. So when we're talking about alt-righters, people on the alt-right, who are kind of scary because they're anti-Semites. They are people who think, are really much in favor of the use of violence where it's completely unnecessary. They're individuals who are, in some sense, they're anti-democratic. They don't really believe in a democracy. Those people are over here. By definition, they have to be over here. And that is because they're not moving in the direction of less government restriction on people and economies. They're over here. And you might ask, well, why is it that communists and fascists have historically hated each other so much? I think that the reason for that is because each sees the other as kind of a traitor to the cause. Why does the left hate Donald Trump as much as they do? I think the reason for that is because they see him as one of them who turned on them. He comes from wealth. He's a New Yorker, New Jersey, blue state guy. He voted Democrat for a very long time. He contributed to the campaigns of various Democrats, Bill and Hillary Clinton, for instance. And then he said, you know what? I'm rejecting all of you people and I'm going to champion the people. The very thing that these people, who are all elitists, hate. He became a champion of a populist movement. Thus the reason they hate him. It's similar with these ideologies. So I want you to understand that what we're seeing with some people who are thought of and that perhaps you listen to because they're podcasters, popular podcasters, that you might think of conservatives, you need to be careful of them because they're not leading you in this direction. They're leading you in that direction. They are sheep in wolves' clothing. I hate to say it, but it's true because some of them I've liked and have even appreciated a lot of what they have to say. And that kind of brings me to what you kind of have to be careful of because there are commentators that you will listen to and you agree with 90% of what they have to say. But buried in that extra 10%, the devil is in those details. You will find yourself signing on to something that is just sheer evil. Not where you just have some modest disagreements, but we're talking about serious disagreements. Now let's contrast these two worldviews with a biblical worldview. So now we come to the biblical view of history. We've been looking at three views of history. The first, actually, we could say four when we throw Darwin into the mix, but the first two are godless, and that is Marxism, socialism, communism. We kind of lump those together as one. Communism is the highest stage of socialism, and Marxism is just Marx's version of socialism. So we group those together, and then there's the fascist view of history, both of which are utterly atheistic. They're utterly godless. They do not see God playing any role in history. Instead, history is being driven by impersonal forces. It's being driven by, again, in the socialist worldview, it's being driven by a war of economics, a war of classes. In the fascist worldview, it is being driven by a war of the blood, a war of races. Now we come to the biblical worldview. Now, what is important to understand in this, historians are always trying to think of a better way of interpreting and understanding history. How do we go about doing that? And that's how we come up with, say, for instance, names for different periods of history. We look at, the classical age, and then we come forward to the Middle Ages, also sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, and then we find ourselves at the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, moving through all these stages. It's historians who are looking back and who are naming these periods of time. Jacob Burckhardt very famously, did this with the so-called Enlightenment. So the biblical worldview sees history as moving in a particular direction too. So in that sense, we could say that Karl Popper might have labeled the biblical worldview as historicist as well. But basically, where again, socialism and fascism say we're moving from simplistic to the more complicated because they're stealing the idea from Darwin. The biblical worldview says that we are also moving irresistibly in a particular direction. What is that? We're moving from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, from the beginning to the end of human history irresistibly. But it doesn't have to do with us moving from, say in the Darwinian notion, this idea of a simplistic organisms to much more complex ones. It has to do with the fact that God, in this view of history, God is controlling history, and he's moving us in a particular direction, and he steps into history quite literally if you read John chapter 1, where it says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We're here at the Christmas season. We're celebrating the incarnation, are we not? So it is this view that this is the direction that we are headed, and that at the end of human history, of world history, that God himself steps onto the stage for a second time, but this time to judge. So we're moving in a particular direction. And if there was any kind of slant to this that we might give it, it might be a moral descent, that we're actually moving towards, utter chaos and would destroy ourselves except for the fact that God intervenes. This is the biblical worldview. Now, the biblical worldview, when it comes to history, we can point to one chapter in particular, and I've discussed this before because I'm absolutely fascinated by it as a historian. Because again, historians are often looking at ways to try to understand history. Is history this? Is it cyclical? Does it, as George Santayana said, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Is it, as he said, cyclical, just repeating itself over and over again? I think Leon Uris, the great novelist, said of Ireland has no future. It's just the past repeating itself all over again. So it is this idea that history is cyclical. But the Darwinian, the socialist, the fascist view is that history isn't cyclical, that history is instead linear. It is moving in a straight line. And along the way, there are certain things that happen that bring about changes in history, but nonetheless, it is moving irresistibly in a particular direction. So the biblical view, I would say, is kind of a combination. The biblical view looks something more like this. There is a sense in which history does repeat itself. We can see this, and this is because human nature doesn't change. Every intelligent person I've ever met believes that human nature is the same the world over. And because of that, human beings, being what we are, and for the fact that we are fallen, that we're sinful, that we repeat certain mistakes over and over again. So in a sense, we can say that there is a predictive quality to history. If you know the past, you have some ability, not like a soothsayer, not like a fortune teller, and not in some kind of Nostradamus fashion, but that you can predict to a limited degree what will happen. Because we can say, in the past, we did this, and this is where it led. Probably going to take us there again. But the biblical worldview is articulated even in more depth when it comes to history. And again, this absolutely fascinates me, and it does because this is a passage I've thought on for so long as to its actual meaning for decades. And it begins in Romans chapter 1. Again, you don't have to be a Christian. If you're not a Christian, just listen because you might find this interesting. Regardless of whether you believe in a God or not, the Apostle Paul, who wrote this, was one of the most learned men of his generation, of his day. He was highly educated. He was an academic. He was very learned in Greek philosophy, in the Hebrew scriptures, and he understood well the problems of his own day. And he's the one who wrote this. And this is what he says. This is Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who, by their unrighteousness, suppressed the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. So just a little pause there. Someone was commenting on the YouTube channel. They were saying that, if God was so smart, they were responding to one of our debates. We've done a number of high-level academic debates. They have millions of views. You can go and look at those. But someone was dropping comments in there and saying, if God was so smart, why didn't he reveal himself to somebody other than to Christians? Well, according to this passage, he's revealed himself to everyone in the things that have been made. In the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. So one day, if you believe the biblical view, there will be a judgment. And when you stand before God, you cannot say with any justification, well, I didn't know you were there. He'll say, I revealed myself in the things that have been made. I mean, the psalmist said, creation declares the glory of God, meaning quite literally, creation declares the glory of God. But let's just say you're Stevie Wonder. Let's just say you're Helen Keller. You never saw a night sky. You never actually saw creation. Well, Romans chapter 2, verse 15 says, you know what? God hasn't conspired against you. He's revealed himself to you in another way. And the way that he did that was by writing his law upon your hearts. He's implanted in you a kind of black box, as it were, a tractor beam, that's saying to you, I'm real. And if you seek, you'll find. But anyway, that's not really so much my point today, but I did want to answer that YouTuber's question in case that person is watching. Picking up with verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Pay close attention here. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And then what follows after that is he's laying out all the terrible things they did. So, what is this view of history? Let's look at this. A waterfall has what we call cataracts in it. That is to say, a river rather, has cataracts in it, smaller waterfalls. If you've ever been, down, rapids, tubing, or in a canoe, you really got to be skilled to do it in a canoe or kayaking or something like that. You'll go through rapids. You'll do this, and we call those cataracts. So, according to this view of history, history looks something like this. There are a series of 3 cataracts, 3 waterfalls, until we get to absolutely a cliff. And if you were listening carefully to what I read there, the Apostle Paul says God gave them up 3 times. God gave them up, God gave them up, God gave them up. So it's a series of God letting go. Now, I often tell the story that when I was a boy and we had a horse, and sometimes I've been more bold than wise. This horse was unbroken. I was maybe 4 or 5 at the time. This horse was unbroken, and we didn't even have we didn't have a saddle for this horse. But I remember telling my mother, that I wanted to ride Belle, B-E-L-L-E. A better name would have been Hell, because this horse was absolutely wild and untamed. But here we have her in the stall. I get on top of her. I'm holding on to her mane. And I say to my mother, who misunderstood me, to hold on to the reins. And she thought I said, let go of the reins. And so she did. And Belle took out of that stall, and moments later, we're bucking around, and I am bucked straight off, and I have a nice Harrison Ford scar that's hidden, in my beard, blood everywhere. And I've never forgotten that event. I've never forgotten that. And the miscommunication between myself and my mom. But I often think of that when I think of this particular passage, because what it's saying is, when it says that God gave them up, God gave them up, God gave them up, is it gives you this picture, kind of like Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 1 says that God upholds the universe by the word of his power. So the fact that the whole solar system, that the universe itself doesn't explode like the Death Star, is because God himself sustains it. He upholds it. In a sense, he also upholds the moral order by restraining us from the things that we might otherwise do. But if you know the story of Samson in the Old Testament, it says that God withdrew the spirit from him. And the result was that Samson just went and did whatever he wanted, you see. And it ultimately did enormous harm to himself, ultimately causing his arrest, his eyes being gouged out, and his death. So, when you're violating conscience again and again, and you're violating, the Holy Spirit speaking to you, the biblical argument is, whether or not you believe in it is entirely up to you, but the biblical argument is that eventually God gives you up. And here, it's God giving up in 3 stages. So it's like holding on to the reins of the horse that I was on and letting go a little bit, and letting go a little bit more, and then ultimately going, fine, have it your way. You think you can ride that horse? You go ahead, have at it. So it's God giving up. And what happens in these 3 stages? Tell us if this doesn't sound like this was written last week. The first stage, moving towards depravity. So the argument is that history is moving in a direction, and when you violate certain moral principles, it takes you this way. It takes you this way. So again, we're answering the question, how did we get into the mess that we're in the Western world? The Apostle Paul here is telling you, because he's giving you a blueprint in explaining that it doesn't matter if you're the Babylonians, or you're the Greeks, or the Romans, or you're the Soviet Empire, or the United States. If you do these things, this is what happens. So what we're told is that, first of all, it begins with, we're told, suppression and belief in God and thanklessness. Thanklessness. Man, is that important. This is why I stress so much. I did this a little bit on Twitter, but I think I did this on this show and also on WTF. The importance of giving thanks, and not giving thanks to some vague deity. This is what a lot of people do these days. It's like they'll wear a shirt that says blessed. Sometimes it's spelled B-L-E-S-T. It's like an expression that's absolutely meaningless, that they are somehow blessed. By whom or by what? This is the question you should ask. So around my Thanksgiving table, we go around and we give thanks, but I always stress, we're not thankful to ourselves here. We're thankful for other people who've been gracious and kind and generous to us, but we're chiefly grateful to God, who is the true founder of the feast, who in good times and bad, he's the one to whom we give thanks. So thankfulness is extremely important. And here the Apostle Paul says, because they were thankless and they would not give God thanks, they started moving in this direction. And the first stage that God gives them up the first time is a worship of nature. Notice he said here that the worship of creeping things, and again, I need more chalk. I'm terrible in regards to this, people. I'm always going through so much chalk. Some of you will say, well, why don't you use a dry erase marker? Well, that's because I'm old school. I'm old school, and also because we get glare off of a whiteboard. And they have yet to invent a marker board that I like. I want to feel the chalk. Anyway, so worship of nature, or I put natures here, worship of nature. Do you think we're there? Do you think we're doing that as a society? Well, I think we are. We most definitely are. People get more upset, more exercised over cruelty to animals than they do by cruelty to children, than they are by cruelty to human beings. You can post on social media, a story of, saving a cat, and it will get, hundreds of thousands of likes. But if you go on there and you're talking about the war against children, and there absolutely is a war against children in our own time, you can bet hardly anybody pay attention to that. Now, I myself am an animal lover, at least some of them. My dog Ranger, you hear me talk about him all the time. I love Ranger. The cruelty to animals is actually, spoken about as something that is wrong, in Scripture. But we don't worship nature, or rather we shouldn't worship nature. Peter Singer, I mentioned before that we have debates on our YouTube channel. And one of them, or maybe a couple of them, are debates that we did with Peter Singer. If you don't know who Peter Singer is, he's arguably the most influential philosopher of the second half of the 20th century and beyond. He's the father of the animal rights movement. He wrote a book, very popular book, that really started the animal rights movement, which led to the creation of things like PETA, when he wrote in 1975 a book called Animal Liberation. Peter Singer gets really, really upset about what is happening to animals, less so about what happens to human beings. And see, this is how warped the thinking is in this regard. So where you start elevating animal life and de-elevating human life. But it also leads to a kind of modern paganism where you sort of in this avatar kind of way begin to believe that there's some sort of animistic creation connection with nature. And of course, there isn't. Now, the biblical view is that we're supposed to be good stewards of our environment, but that we're not supposed to worship it. We worship God, and we recognize that He's the one who created nature, and He created human beings to sit at the top, the pinnacle of the created order, and that we're to have dominion over all of it, and it's to be used for our purposes. That means eating it, that means cultivating it, that means developing it, all of those things. But anyway, worship of nature. So when human beings started worshiping nature, the Apostle Paul says God gave them up. So that's the first series of kind of letting go of the reins a little bit. So the horse is starting to get a little bit free. Then the second time he says God gave them up, he brings us to this. Now, I'm not going to say this word out loud because, it might get us choked on this channel. But anyway, this topic right here, this issue right here is the Apostle Paul says their lust turned in on one another, men and women, but not for each other. And he says that this is the second place. So God gave them up. God gave them up. So this is again where you're going through the series of cataracts and you're headed towards the waterfall itself. I mean, this is Niagara. This is Victoria Falls. This is a massive fall right here that leads to the total destruction of an entire civilization, a society. So God gave them up. God gave them up. And then the third one, he says this, that God gave them up to a debased mind. And there, when he says that he then lists beneath it all the terrible things that follow. He says that they're slanderers and murderers and they dishonor parents and they're liars and they're all these things. And that's because they've been given over to a debased mind. Now, have we seen this in Western culture? Have we seen worship of nature, worship of animals? Yes. Have we seen this kind of perversion? Yes. Have we seen this? You better believe that we have. And this is where you get to the point where you become so untethered morally, you don't really even have a sense of what's right and what's wrong. There's a very scary verse that says this, and it's a verse that you need to bear in mind, whether you're a Christian or not, and it's this. It says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but it only brings him death. Meaning we are so self-deceived, our capacity for self-deception is so great that we can convince ourselves that something is moral and right when it isn't. Now, how do we avoid that? When I was a young man and I was getting my scuba certification, one of the basic principles they teach you is how to navigate underwater. And our particular instructor, he was a real character, and he liked to put us in dangerous circumstances. So, for instance, he would take you, down, and let's say when you're just learning in a pool, and then later he would take you out into the ocean or somewhere else and repeat these things. But he would take you down, and then he would shut off your air tank, to see what you would do. Did you panic, or did you do the things that you're supposed to do? Or he would come and knock your mask off. Do you panic, or do you do the things that you're supposed to do? Now, some of you are going to say, he probably got people killed doing this. He did not, and that's because you have a whole class, other people who are watching. This is coming, and he's prepared to take you to the surface in case you do panic or something like that happens. But the point is, he was teaching you how to respond in these things, so that, because they do happen, accidents do happen, and the way to prepare for an accident is by, to the extent that you can, kind of like boot camp, trying to approximate those circumstances as close as you can. Now, you can't do it perfectly, but you can do a little bit. And one of those things was to take you into utter darkness, like a cave, cave diving, where you can't see your hand in front of your face. Or into a circumstance where your fins, have stirred up sediment off the bottom and you can't navigate because you can't see. You can't see which way is up or down. What do they teach you to do in those circumstances? They tell you to look at your bubbles. Now, in utter darkness, you can't see your bubbles, but you can feel them. You can feel which direction they're going. And so when you're underwater and you have achieved what's called neutral buoyancy, you might be deceived into thinking that's the direction to go up, to go to the surface, when in fact that's the way to go, or that's the way to go. So the way you navigate, the way you find your way to the surface, is by following your bubbles. Bubbles, it's an interesting scientific fact, ladies and gentlemen. Bubbles never go sideways. They never go down. They always go up. And so if you've lost your way, the way you find your way out is by following the bubbles. Well, the way we follow our bubbles when we get into a situation like this, and we can all see that this is where we've gone. This is where we've gone. And I believe that with this election, we are being given another chance by God, who has stopped us from going off of this edge. Perhaps. We shall see. But stopping us right here and saying, I haven't totally let go of the reins here. But once you go over this, it's societal destruction. It's complete societal destruction. So it's important for us to understand that this is where we've been going. So when you want to understand, how did we get in this mess to begin with? Well, we got to come back here. We started here by suppressing the truth about God, suppressing belief in God, which leads to thanklessness. And then once you do that, you start doing all of these things. You become morally and intellectually, it's not just morally, but you become intellectually untethered, so that you lose all sense of rationality. And we've seen all of that. A debased mind, people with whom you cannot reason about anything because they're utterly debased in the way they think. They're not following bubbles anymore, but that's what we can do. And the way we do that is, I believe, by looking at God's Word, because it gives us direction of the way that we go. And this brings me to the comments. I'll close this particular episode of Ideas Have Consequences with comments. But one of the comments that I got is from a guy, his screen name is Paul Richards, 2365 on YouTube. And this is what he said. He said, well, you pretty well said that there's nothing we can do. Ladies and gentlemen, I've never said that. I have never said that. I don't believe that. I've told you that I feel pretty optimistic about the direction that we're going. I didn't a couple of months ago because we're absolutely headed in this direction. But I do believe that we're on the verge of revival in this country. Not there yet, but we could be. And I think if we don't sit on our hands, we can turn this thing around. And the first place we start is by reversing this. And what is that? thankfulness. If this is what started us in the direction that we've been headed by suppressing the truth about God and by being thankless, the easy answer, the obvious answer for reversing it is by not suppressing the truth of God and by being thankful. By being thankful. I urge you every day, there's nothing worse, honestly. We've all done it, where your life is pretty good, but you don't realize it. And then you lose your health for a period of time, or you find yourself in the hospital, or a loved one dies, or you find yourself in some kind of crisis, and then you just think to yourself, if only my life was like it was last week. You ever been there? I've been there. And then you feel just a bit of regret that you weren't grateful for what you had at that time. Be thankful. Give thanks. Give thanks again to not some vague deity, but give thanks to God, and do it every day. Be thankful for what you have materially, spiritually, the people in your life. Make a point of thanking them. So that's an obvious way to start heading in this direction. Now, what are some other things that you can do? And this is kind of taking it in a slightly different direction, because we've been talking about left and right, ideologically speaking. The left is all about tyranny. How can you resist tyranny? Let me give you some very practical ways. We talked about this on the Ideas Have Consequences book club. Some of you are part of that book club. And I talked about being the fly in the ointment. You don't have to have a big platform, for a show like this one. You don't have to be an author who's published in, all the big, news publications. You don't have to be a celebrity. You just have to be someone who is faithful. You just have to be someone who is faithful. Now, I'm going to give you some real basic ways of resisting. And here are a few. Coming through the airports, when you're going to board a plane, or maybe you're going through immigration, passport control, or coming back into the country, something that they're doing these days is they're taking your photograph. You need to say no to that. And that's because, first of all, you have a constitutional right to say no. Now, they kind of make that not known to you, but if you read the placard that they have up, it says that you can opt out of the photograph. It is not required. You may say, why would I want to? I don't care. Well, because this is all moving us in the direction of facial recognition, and in a way that will become very tyrannous to you. You won't be able to go to a grocery store. You won't be able to go and pay your taxes. You won't be able to do anything without facial recognition. That is the automobiles will become that way. You need to opt out of that. And the way I do it is I just come up and they say, stand here for the photo. They don't even tell you that it is an option for you. And what I see is people getting in the stanchions, let's say flying into Atlanta or Houston, so you're looking back at hundreds of people, and then the customs agent, calls you forward. And you step forward and he says, stand right there and take your glasses off. And I say, don't want my photo taken. Now, on a few occasions, they've asked me why. I tell them that's none of their business, and it isn't their business. You don't have to give them that answer. Sometimes I just say it's because it's my constitutional right to opt out. I don't want the photo taken. One border guy has said to me, well, your picture's all over the internet. And I said, well, then if you know that, then why are you trying to take it now? Just get one of those. Sometimes they might give you a hard time and make it less efficient for you because they want you to submit to it. But I wanted to shout back, every time I do this, to shout back to the hundreds of people in line and say, every one of you needs to say no to this. Because the fact that you are meekly submitting to it means this is what your future is going to be. But if people say, no, I don't want that, they'll give up on it. You need to be a fly in the ointment and say no. I have been noticing also that increasingly corporate America is demanding that you give private information. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So again, flying. I'm in the Houston airport, and there's no place to sit near my gate. And we're going to be boarding in about 15 minutes. So a place where I see that I can sit is at a bar where I can see my gate. And I've been walking around for a couple of hours. So I'm tired of doing that. So I sit down and I decide, I'm going to sit here. They're going to expect me to order something fine. I ordered an Aperol Spritz. And the bartender said to me, take your phone and scan that QR code and you order via your phone. And I said, but I'm sitting right here and you're right there. Why do I want to do that? Anyway, but I take my phone and I put it on there and it wants my phone number, my name, all these things to order an Aperol Spritz. And I finally said, I'm not doing that. He said, well, that's the way we do it. And I said, well, actually, by law, you have to take my cash. You're right there. I want an Aperol Spritz. I'm not jumping through your hoops. Now, again, think about that. Some of you may say you don't care. You should care because they're collecting your private information. And I promise you, they should pay you to collect your private information. You shouldn't give it away to anybody. Go into the grocery store. Can I have your phone number? No. Say no. Can I have yours? They're not giving you theirs. You need to say no to these things. Another example, the other day I was going to Express Oil Change in Birmingham and I needed my tires rotated. So I pull up and a guy walks out and he says, yes, sir, what can we do for you? I said, I don't need my oil change. I just need my tires rotated quickly. Can you do that for me? I have a 1 o'clock meeting. He said, yeah, but pull into the bay here. He said, I'll go and ask the manager if we have time to do it. But if you'll just pull into the bay here, we'll begin collecting your information. I said, you don't need my information. I need my tires rotated. He said, well, we just want to get you into the system. I said, don't need to be in your system. I just need my tires rotated. Now, he was getting a little bit irritated, but the fact of the matter is they wanted my phone number, my address, my email, all of those things to rotate my tire. I said, no, 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 and no. I need my tires rotated. Eventually they rotated the tires and I paid them $29.99. Now, I know that some of you, maybe you're not as forceful a personality as say I might be or some others, but it doesn't mean you have to be rude about it. Frankly, I see them as being rude for asking for information that they don't have a right to have. If I go and get my oil changed, why does somebody need my personal information for that? I should just be able to walk in and pay for it and leave. You don't need to know who I am. You don't need to know all that. And you need to say no. You need to opt out of things like that. Companies are doing this everywhere. And this is going to lead to massive tyranny in your life if you don't start saying no. And they're doing it increasingly like it's their right to do it. I just refuse. Don't want to give you that information. Sometimes I say, well, it's on the internet or whatever. Fine, go collect it there. But I'm not giving it to you. You don't have a right to ask for that. The next thing that you can do is reward by posting positive reviews and comments to those who do it right. Here's an example. I had ordered a gift off of the Ralph Lauren website. Okay? It was the wrong one. What I got I take that back. It wasn't their fault, it was mine. I accidentally ordered 2 of the same item. So I called them up to say, what do I do about this? How do I get my money back? How do I send this back? Instead of sending me through this long phone tree and hiding their phone number from me and giving me an AI chat bot, a real human being answered the phone. She was very polite. She was extremely helpful. She sent me a link where I could print out a label and put it on the box and send it immediately back, and then they immediately credited me back the amount of money that I'd spent. I want to praise them for that. Thank you so much, Ralph Lauren or Ralph Lauren or however you say it. They did it the right way. They had a real human being, which I like. I don't want the endless phone trees. I don't want the AI. And when they asked for my review, I made a point of telling them, thank you for having a real human being. Yes, Sheila or whatever her name was, she was great. She was extremely helpful. She was efficient. She was polite. She did her job with efficiency and eagerness. Take the time to thank those companies that do it the right way. Don't just be that person who only posts reviews or comments when you're angry. Make sure you post them when you have something positive to say. Now, here's a few more comments that I want to read to you. I can't respond to every comment. I do what I can, but these are ones that are exceptional that give me the opportunity to really go into bigger issues here. First one is from David Limbaugh, Rush Limbaugh's brother. I know David. David is a great guy. He's a patriot. He is a wonderful American, but he sent me this message, which I thought was great. Out of the clear blue, I didn't solicit this at all. He said, Larry, if I still had some of Rush's cigars, I can't think of a better recipient than you. David, thank you so much. That is such an honor to hear that if you had some of Rush's cigars, I don't know that I would smoke them. I would probably put them in a humidor and, under glass and make it a kind of a historical exhibit, of some kind. But I wish I had some of his cigars too. But the very fact that you say that I would be a worthy recipient of them is terrific. Rush Limbaugh, for those of you who don't know, Rush Limbaugh was really key in launching my writing career. And that is because I was publishing for USA Today. I didn't work for USA Today. I was a freelancer. And I'd published a piece in USA Today on Tim Tebow. And the next thing I know, I start getting texts from friends saying, Rush is reading your entire article over the air. He's calling it brilliant. And that was fantastic. It went on to become one of USA Today's most read articles in the digital age up to that time. And that was fantastic. And what I love that Rush did, that almost nobody does, a lot of people would read your book or your column, they would reword your ideas and they would pass them off as their own. That isn't what Rush did. Rush began by saying, this is an article written by Larry Taunton, Taunton. Then he read the entire article, and again, he said my name and he spelled it. What a gracious thing to do. What a very gracious thing to do. He didn't steal my ideas. He presented them as mine, and he praised them and made sure people knew who I was and that they would buy my books and whatnot. I was grateful for that. And David and I, we've gotten to know each other, and he says he knew of me through Rush because he knew that Rush read my stuff. But anyway, so grateful for that comment. David, here's a comment from someone in response to me saying, I don't really care what people in other countries think of my president. And this person has a very good response to that. You may not care what we think of your president, but we care, because the United States is a big player in the field, and what happens there will affect us all. So in a way, your president is somehow also our president. This is a good comment, and it's a fair comment. There's no question that what happens in the United States, it's a ripple effect out to other nations. I should probably specify more of what I meant by that. Is I was commenting on the fact that the left has been, American left has always been overly concerned what the French or the British or the Germans think of America. And they don't live here. They're not U.S. citizens. I don't consult with them on how I vote, and thus I don't care. But you are correct in saying this. Brian Myers on YouTube says this. He says, think carefully. You can respond by regurgitating dogma or say what you know is true. Any religion that requires you to reject your God-given ability to reason is suspect. I know it's cool these days to do so, but be strong. So this is a guy that is of the view that to believe in God means that you set aside rationality, that you set aside your intellect. This is a laughable notion. It is not a biblical notion. Now, I do know that some people who call themselves Christians seem to think that's what it is, but it isn't. Faith is not a leap out into the utterly unknown. Faith is evidential. It's based on whether or not God offers us if-then propositions. If you repent of your sins, then I will forgive you of all your sins, for example. And the question you have to ask yourself is, do you believe that God is good to do what he says that he will do? Is he trustworthy? And as you come to know God, you come to realize that his promises are reliable. Unlike human beings, we all violate promises. We do. We all fail other people. But as you can see, me just laying this out, this is completely rational. You may not believe it, but it's completely rational. It's a rational, logical argument. So belief in God doesn't mean you just believe in whatever. It's evidential. John Piper posted this. This is a Twitter post of John Piper's. It's not a comment in regards to anything that we've done on Ideas Have Consequences. But he said this: presidential election results. Having delivered us from one evil, God now tests us with another. The Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Deuteronomy 13:3. I really want to like John Piper, and John Piper has done an awful lot of good. I'm very appreciative of many of his sermons and much of his ministry. John Piper is not woke. He doesn't fall into the category of a Russell Moore, a David French, or guys like that. That isn't where he is, Tim Keller. But he has been heavily influenced, I think, by where he is, which is in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and he's been heavily affected, which is a blue state, very blue city, and he's been extremely affected, I believe, by the thinking in that city, so that he comes out with these kind of statements every now and then. Pastor Piper, if you can't see the number of deaths that have been avoided as a result of this election, if you can't see the absolute destruction of lives that has been avoided by this election, if you can't see the good that will come as a result of this election, you're blind. You're absolutely blind. And I'm staggered by these kinds of tweets. This is idiotic. And I'd be happy to debate the subject with John Piper. Rich posted this comment. Trump has officially announced he's getting rid of the Department of Education. Honestly, this is what's done it for me. You're an imbecile if you don't vote against this dude. You're an idiot. He said it more colorfully than that. Y'all have no clue of the ramification, no effing idea. You are all a-holes. Rich, I invite you to come on the show. I'd be glad to debate you on this topic. The Department of Education is an ideological institution. It is no longer about educating kids. It hasn't existed except until 1979. America seemed to get along pretty well before that. Indeed, since 1979, standards in our schools have done nothing. Test scores have done nothing but plummet since that time. We do not need the Department of Education. I am very much in favor of abolishing it and returning power to the states. And that is where we will end this episode of Ideas Have Consequences, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that this right here is somewhat clear to you. Again, I can't get into all the minutiae and answer every single question, but I hope this becomes clear to you, these three major views of history, that which is godless, and that is from a Christian point of view. This has been Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.